Hello, there may be some confusion regarding what we can and can't do in this COVID age. There is now one law for one lot of people and then another law for everybody else. Knowing the huge risk to Victoria's health system, would Dan Andrews allow a mass rally to happen?
No. Yes.
What about Queensland? Border closure being a catalyst for business closure because we all need to be saved. Would Premier Palaszczuk really allow a mass rally to happen?
No. Yes.
And if you're having a bit of trouble understanding Queensland's border decision to keep out the infected ones and to save us all, while at the same time allowing the tourism industry and small business to die for the good of the state, then we have this explaining border closure policy.
Yes, I do see that there is a real dilemma here. In that while it has been government policy to regard policy as the responsibility of ministers and administration as the responsibility of officials, the questions of administrative policy can cause confusion between the policy of administration and the administration's policy, especially when responsibility for the administration of the policy of administration conflicts or overlaps with responsibility for the policy of the administration of policy.
Well, that's a load of meaningless dribble.
Simples.
You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Today on Coast Business Radio, Dr John Coyne from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute recently published a paper with Peter Jennings. It was called After COVID-19, Australia and the World Rebuild. Now, the paper states that big changes are needed to prepare the country and the world for future threats such as COVID-19.
The world is in a period of increasing strategic uncertainty and unpredictability, and that is flowing out and having impacts across the board on everything from our economy to our relationship with people, with other countries in the region.
Professor Veena Sahajwalla says Australia has had a big wake-up call from COVID-19 and Chinese dependency.
I think it's all about creative thinking and looking at how it all connects into manufacturing.
A pandemic simulation in Australia and other parts of the world was held last year and in 2018. Professor Raina MacIntyre, one of the world's leading emerging infectious diseases experts, says the results were uncanny.
Many of the things that we exercised in Pacific Eclipse, which was the name of the exercise, did occur during the COVID pandemic.
Professor James Laurenceson, director of the Australia-China Relations Institute, says Chinese influence in Australian academic institutions and politics is a real problem. And an imaginary problem.
So this is what makes studying the Australia-China relationship complicated, because there's a lot of real stuff happening that is of genuine concern, and there's a bit of an imaginary stuff as well.
And finally, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast. Coming up next, Dr John Coyne.
This is the Coast Business Radio podcast.
The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, is an independent, non-partisan think tank that produces expert and timely advice for Australia's strategic and defence leaders. Dr John Coyne is Head of Strategic Policing and Law Enforcement and Head of the North and Australia Security at the Institute. He is author of The Role of Strategic Intelligence in Law Enforcement, and John has worked in intelligence and national security for over 25 years. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mike.
John, ASPI recently released a paper that you edited with Peter Jennings called After COVID-19, Australia and the World Rebuild, Volume 1. The paper states that big changes are needed to prepare the country and the world for future threats such as COVID-19. Tell us about some of the main recommendations, including some of the most challenging that Australia needs to confront.
Look, Mike, I think right from the start, this was a really amazing publication to work on. So just so your listeners have this in context. So what we went out and we got about 27 chapters done. And what we asked people to do, we said, what impact did COVID-19 have on their specific research topic? Well, how will they recover? Will there be differences in the future? And what policy prescriptions could they recommend? And what we actually asked them on top of that is we said, you know what, we want you to think big and bold. What's important out of that publication is and understanding where we come from in a think tank is that so ASPI has no corporate opinion on anything. What we do is all those authors have given their opinion. So there's lots of recommendations in there. But what the message is clear from this, and the key recommendations really are, which is that number one is that the world is in a period of increasing strategic uncertainty and unpredictability, and that is flowing out and having impacts across the board on everything from our economy to our relationship with people, with other countries in the region. Number two is that we have a once in probably 100-year opportunity to recheck and relook at the assumptions that underpin our major policies in this country. To look and see if we got them wrong, because COVID-19 has shown that we have got a number of them wrong, and that we have some particularly difficult and prickly problems to solve in terms of national security vulnerabilities in this country. Now, that might all sound negative, but the next part is, and as I'm a 25-year veteran of the intelligence and security community, so having worked all my life, bar 1 year or adult life, bar 1 year as an analyst or an intelligence person, I say this to you, which is that normally I'm a pessimist and a cynic. So normally a publication like this, I would be writing and telling you all of the problems in the world. But I also sit there and think that we're at a crossroads. So this isn't like the global financial crisis. So this isn't just a little stop, pause, cut the cloth back on our economy and our national spending for a period of time, and we'll come out the other end. What we have here is, probably a once in a lifetime, an opportunity, something akin to the years after World War II, or possibly the heady years of the 1970s, of actually doing some really great nation building in this country. But to realise that, the key recommendations are we need to reconsider all of our assumptions about our nation and how it's going to operate in this post-COVID world.
What about organised crime? Because that's your forte, or one of your fortes. Organised crime had been mentioned in certain dispatches on the news, such as the fake medical supplies and medicines and stuff. Have you ever come across organised crime like this in a crisis like this before?
Look, you always see it. The thing to remember about organised crime is the good people who, when I say good, the ones who are most effective at being criminals, they're incredibly entrepreneurial and able to move on a dime. So they're going to approach these, and this is what we've seen globally. So we've seen very different reactions globally in organised crime. So in the favelas of South America, we've seen gangs using this as an opportunity to get even and execute people. In other places, we've seen in Central and South America, we've seen gangs decide to legitimise what they're doing, or organised crime groups, by putting themselves forward as an alternative sense of government and authority. But, when it comes to fake pharmaceuticals, Australia has a long history of having very secure supply chains. If you're in Africa or Asia, this problem of fake pharmaceuticals is something that you face every day. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people die every year from malaria because of fake pharmaceuticals that are sold. Australia in the past has fallen victim to fake PPE or personal protective equipment coming into this country. But now, all of a sudden, and certainly, we're already seeing this, and we've seen it over the last several weeks, increased siege at Australia's borders of these sorts of goods. And what we're seeing is three separate really markets here. So on one side we have fake pharmaceuticals. So this is when you go to get an anti-malaria tablet, or you go to get a Panadol, and it's nothing. It's a placebo at best. The other issue you face is that sort of copyright. So what happens is an organised crime group will take a proprietary product like paracetamol and make their own, and then market it and make it look exactly like a brand product like Panadol and import it in the country. And on the other side of it is, and we saw this in the sort of in various places around the globe, is the production of substandard personal protective equipment. Made at a cut price and sold at a pride profit, because there's a huge demand and an insufficient supply for these sorts of supplies. So what we're seeing is that's the initial reaction of the criminal market. There's an opportunity here, there's a vulnerability in the supply chains, and they're going to exploit it, and they certainly have.
Obviously, they make the most of an opportunity. What's the scale of the problem of fake medical supplies, for example, not just in Australia, but in our region?
Look, I mean, we're talking, it's extensive, like what we're talking here is millions upon millions and tens of millions of dollars of profit to be made by organised crime groups. And ironically, these are the same crime groups at times who make the choice between being involved in the distribution of illicit drugs. Now, probably more people die from fake pharmaceuticals regionally, yet the criminal the offences don't bring the same level of punishment as drug trafficking. So, I can be involved in the distribution of fake pharmaceuticals, and perhaps in some jurisdictions I'll be lucky to get a slap on the wrist.
That's just terrible, though.
Well, look, it is, and this is the nature. I guess my point for your listeners is quite often people sit there and think of organised crime in the sense of. They think about it in the sense of, there's El Chapos, that they're great big drug lords killing, thousands of people using weapons and living luxurious lifestyles by pools. That's sort of not the case. Like we're seeing the rise, certainly in our own region. So in the Golden Triangle, we're seeing the rise of a whole new kind of organised crime group, one that integrates across various other gangs. So they take pharmaceuticals from the chemical and pharmaceutical industry in China, import them illegally into Myanmar. In the jungles of Myanmar, they're producing methamphetamine, synthetic opioids. They're then moving it down through places like Thailand and Vietnam. They're then shipping it in legitimate products across to Australia. They're then moving it through alternative supply chains in through Canada and back through Australia, into the US. Then they're laundering their profits through the legitimate economy and dragging them into the casino industries across our region. And, we're talking about industrial level production. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to visit what they call a clandestine lab. In Australia, a clandestine lab might be found to produce methamphetamine might be found in a garage. This was a 20-acre clandestine lab.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's the scale of what we're talking about here.
Do you think the organised crime, it's been sanctioned by governments, and I'm just referring to the PPEs here, sent back to China just before we were whacked around the head with COVID-19. Government-sanctioned crime, is that a major concern?
Look, I think this is a tough one. So if you're asking me the question, and it depends on what sorts of crimes. So if we're just talking about PPE here, if your question is the Chinese government complicit in the distribution of fake medical products, then my answer to that would probably be no. If you ask me the question, is it possible that corrupt officials within the Chinese government were involved in some shape, form or description, I think that's a strong possibility. But really the issue here is that it's incredibly difficult and has been so for many, many years. So while the Chinese government's economic miracle has been amazing in dragging people out of poverty and generating huge amounts of industry, and no one can doubt that. Secondly, about building the Belt and Road Initiative across the globe, no one can doubt that. What they've not been effective at is legislating compliance across their various industries, and some industries, and especially in manufacturing and chemical and pharmaceuticals industries, are highly vulnerable to exploitation by criminal groups because the Chinese government doesn't regulate them sufficiently.
But what about, for example, all the sanitizer and all the other protective equipment that they took from Australia and other parts of the world and shipped straight back to China? That just to me seems like it was, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, and the media seems to be on the bandwagon sort of that it was Chinese government sanctioned.
Look, I think that there can be no doubt that in many cases the organisations or companies in Australia that were involved in that were state-owned entities, and that there was at least some state compliance in saying, well, collect as much as you can. In the same way that we see, I think we've been struggling with the issue of baby formula in this country at the retail level and its distribution over the last, 4 or 5 years, and still what we see, I guess hardly a quarter goes by where we don't see a news article or we don't see video footage on our main news channels showing people of Chinese background lining up with 2 cans of, putting 20 or 30 cans of baby formula in a shopping trolley and then putting 2 at a time through the checkout. And then those are being sent back to mainland China. So, and again, this is this issue. I don't think it's state sanctioned in the sense that I don't think that Xi Jinping is sanctioning the movement of those commodities back to China. But I certainly do believe that it's at some level that there's some involvement of Chinese officials.
On the subject of COVID-19, we're still in a sort of a mini lockdown, and it's sort of vanishing as we talk. What's the risk, though, of violent unrest occurring during such a crisis? I mean, this weekend we've got a bunch of protests on, Black Lives Matter, and there's, I believe 40,000 will be in Melbourne, and there's going to be 15,000 in Brisbane. And is it wise to allow mass protests?
Look, first off, and I think there's a lot of issues at play in that question. Now, the first one is about public safety and COVID-19, and the state and territory governments and the National Cabinet have been very clear on this about large gatherings of people, and the health authorities have been very clear in their advice that the likelihood of transmission increases with those sorts of events. So there's number one, separate from any other issue. Number two, and one of my great concerns is that, and I've been saying certainly in some of the stuff that I've written, which is during very challenging periods of time. So right now we're in a recession. Okay, the economic data is out there. We have high unemployment, record high unemployment. That unemployment disproportionately is represented in amongst our young people in Australia. So we have a large number of underemployed or unemployed dissatisfied young Australians. And that poses, they're at risk of being radicalised on a range of issues. So first off, they're being radicalised around issues or potentially open to issues from far-right extremists about that dissatisfaction, just as much as they are open to radicalisation by Islamic fundamentalists or Salafi jihadists. So from my perspective, I think that these sorts of events, that there is always that potential. But we also have to remember, and this is the other part of it, that, one of the strong elements, or the elements that makes us a very strong nation, is the right to have an opinion, and the right to voice that opinion, and the right to make a public demonstration of your opinions. And I think that makes us a richer society for being able to do that. And that's not me agreeing with the protests or not, but my point is that those protests could well be, for police and law enforcement authorities in our country, a tinderbox, and they'll have to be carefully managed.
One thing I've noticed as we finish up here, National Cabinet, okay, all in together, a bit like Monty Python, all the cabinet ministers that say nick. That's what it reminds me of. But they all get together and say yes, and walk out and do their own thing. Okay, for example, borders. Federal government says, don't require the borders. The state says, but we do. And do you think this is perhaps based on political factors? And if so, how can this be avoided?
Look, I think number one is the answer to your question is the federation is the federation. And so we're a federation of states and territories, and as a result of that, of course, under law, many decisions can be made independent of the federal government, and that's just a part of our constitution. I agree with, and the Prime Minister agreed. A member of the media made a quote just recently that, asked the question of the Prime Minister of whether or not whether or not the old COAG was a place where good ideas went to die. And the Prime Minister said that was his experience. I think the National Cabinet has been a resounding success for this country. And I think that in some cases, I think that certain leaders in certainly in Queensland and Victoria have taken, and WA have taken a very careful approach to managing the risks in their specific jurisdictions, and the Federation allows them to do it. Do I think that that's a political decision? I was once asked by a journalist about a decision in Canberra, and I said, well, look, all decisions in Canberra are political, so that's the reality of it. But I think that some borders remain closed because if you could imagine you were a state or territory government, and you opened up your borders and a week later you had an outbreak, despite the fact that you'd been successful in managing the COVID-19 crisis, you would be found wanting. So I think there is a great deal of caution being applied by certain territory and state leaders.
Interesting, the more, it's like they say about animals, the more you know about animals, the more you realise how little you know. The same thing about COVID-19. The more we know about COVID-19, we realise how little we really do know, and it's one of those quandaries. But personally, I think tear those borders down. We need tourism. We need people to travel.
Absolutely, and that's the difference. My personal opinion is, we need to reopen the country. And as I said at the start, my key messages for anyone who's listening to today is, right now we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to reset all of our policies, look at the assumptions that underlie it. And we have a once in a sort of 50-year opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity to restart building a nation again. And I think we should take advantage of both of those opportunities.
Dr John Coyne from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, as he's gasping for air. I think a scotch is on the menu there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
To keep us all safe and to help our health workers, it's vital to know quickly if you've come in contact with someone who has tested positive for coronavirus. It's why we've introduced the COVID Safe app. With your privacy protected by law, COVID Safe keeps a secure note of other users you've been near if you have to go out. So, if they test positive for coronavirus, you'll be notified. It'll help us stop the spread sooner so we can get back to the things we love. Download COVID Safe today. Authorised by the Chief Medical Officer, Canberra.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
Professor Veena Sahajwalla is an internationally recognised materials scientist, engineer and inventor revolutionising recycling science. As the founding director of the Centre of Sustainable Materials Research and Technology, otherwise known as SMART, at the University of New South Wales, Fina is producing a new generation of green materials and products made entirely or primarily from waste. Fina also heads the Australian Research Council, aka ARC, Industrial Transformation Research Hub for Green Manufacturing, a leading national research centre that works in collaboration with industry to ensure new recycling science is translated into real-world environmental and economic benefits. In 2019, Veena was honoured by Engineers Australia as a centenary hero for her work, and in 2018, she was elected as Fellow of the Australian Academy of Science. Veena, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Mike.
Did I get all that right?
Oh, perfect and beautifully said. Thank you. I'm very humbled.
Thank you very much. Now, has Australia had a big wake-up call from COVID-19 and our Chinese dependency?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, Mike. Absolutely. I think in so many different ways. We have had a bit of that kind of, I guess, the pause button or the reset button almost sort of thrown upon us in so many different ways, whether it's our personal lives or our work lives, or really just questioning our sovereign capability, which is, to your point around, are we really sort of well prepared for a crisis as we're facing now, or whatever comes our way in the future? So it's almost sort of, getting us to look at ourselves a bit more carefully.
Is Australia way behind other countries in the use of recycling materials for transformation and manufacture?
I don't think we're that way behind. I think it's all about creative thinking and looking at how it all connects into manufacturing. So I think at the grassroots level, you've got businesses who are so committed, so passionate. And I think to me, that's where it all starts. It starts with, people like us who talk about it in their workplaces. And this is where my journey with Australian manufacturers, started, particularly with the steel industry, where I think no idea was seen as too shocking. Although in this particular case, when I was talking about using tires in steel making, it was a bit of a shock. But I think it was all as part of the spirit of conversation. And I think it was a reflection of the fact that for me, that journey has really never stopped. And the fact that so many businesses want to engage and are open-minded to, I think, creative thinking, and the fact that thought leadership coming from universities, and in this particular case, my role at UNSW, means that it actually opens more doors just because people are curious and are excited at the same time. So I think to me, all of that is a reflection of that ultimate spirit of, we can do this. And if we work together, we can make it happen.
Recycling, when I was at college, it was a pretty cool word, got out in the workforce, and the only recycle part I heard was the threat from my wife threatening to recycle me. But do you think we're doing enough these days?
I think we can certainly do more, and I think it has to start from the fact that everyone in this entire ecosystem, whether it's, citizens, whether it's, businesses, government, everyone has to work together in collaboration. And I think that's really the only way we're going to make it happen. So, you think about just the everyday items, whether they are our plastic, products or indeed the more sophisticated electronics. We have to, at the beginning of this journey, talk about how we're going to work together and enable Australian businesses to take advantage of these resources. So the fact that we can see a lot of these materials and products as resources for our economy is a good way to have a conversation that shows that, very much at the core of all of this is, yes, about the environmental sustainability, but the other side of it that has to go hand in hand is, really looking at circular economies. So the fact that we can see economic benefits and social benefits are important. And there's no reason why we should see these two things as decoupled. So the fact that we can bring the two environmental and economic benefits to, work together and see synergies, that means if we can generate economic opportunities for our businesses, means that they're going to really need to employ more people. So it's, again, about creating new kinds of jobs. And I think all of this means that there are opportunities for us as a country to really, forge ahead with it. We're all passionate about doing it. We all want to collect, our waste resources, put it in the right bins, do all the right things. How can we convert that passion amongst all of us into, economic benefits for the country? And I think, to me, that's really the conversation that needs to happen.
I recall Sting, some years ago, they were talking about climate change and how to save the planet, and he said two things. He said, first of all, plant more trees. It was one, and it was a fairly simple idea. And secondly, the message was to recycle. Those two, they always stuck out, because to me it said that, it's not a complicated procedure to save the planet. And recycling is just one of those. And it's good business too.
Oh, absolutely. Because if we actually look at materials that go into making all the things that we need, whether it's talking about making electronics or indeed our batteries, or just the things, simple things at home, I think everything requires some form of material that goes into production. So the fact that we can actually regenerate our materials over and over again to bring it back to life in different forms, different products, actually is a really cool way to think about recycling. It's recycling and reforming, because you're actually bringing perhaps products back to life in a completely new form. And that just goes to show that, we can be really clever in the way we think about recycling. It doesn't have to be converting like for like. You don't have to make a plastic bottle or a plastic printer. into another plastic printer. And that's exactly what we're doing at Smart Center at UNSW, where, we're showing that we can take plastics, convert it into a plastic filament. So we start from our electronics waste plastics and produces plastic filaments, and that then goes into 3D printing. It shows that you can actually convert a printer, which we might look at an old printer, an obsolete printer, and go, oh gosh, what can we do with it? To really imagining what this product could look like in a whole new form. And that's why I think, to me, that clever business strategy to go with environmental benefits and therefore the obvious social benefits of creating exciting new jobs around what we could play a role in. Because imagine these plastic filaments, and you might say, well, okay, we've created more than what we need in Australia. So imagine a scenario that happens like that. Well, at least what we would have done for ourselves, not only been, self-sufficient in using and making these products in Australia, but also equally importantly, creating an export opportunity. Because let's face it, right now, we're importing a lot of these plastic filaments for our 3D printers, and it's literally becoming so common, just like, we print color sort of paper products at home. Imagine in the future, all kids in schools and educational institutes having their own 3D printers, and therefore this becomes a very standard item. Now, it might look like a fairly straightforward thing, but you might go, well, okay, but it's a product that actually is expensive. So it's back to that point that just because it's made out of recycled plastics doesn't mean it's low quality. In fact, if anything, if you make it into a high quality, high performance product, people love to use it because you still get the functionality out of it. And at the same time, you're potentially creating a solution that's good for our environment.
Tell us about some of your work and the achievements of the Smart Centre.
Yeah, so, just some of these technologies we've been kind of just touching upon. This example of using, some of the waste plastics and converting those into plastic filaments for 3D printing is one example. We set up our own micro factory to show that the technology can actually be deployed in a really small setting. So a micro factory is really about, distributed and decentralized manufacturing capabilities. So the whole concept and what we have actually proven by, walking the talk ourselves at UNSW and setting up and running these micro factories, and this example of one particular case where we can show that the quality of the product is as good as anything that you could purchase made out of virgin resources is the point of having these micro factories. So we can then imagine a future where we can have these types of distributed solutions where waste is the primary input material. Enables us to actually take that concept out in so many different ways. Another example we're working on at the moment is using waste glass and textiles, and that hybrid, material, which then is a combination of glass and textiles in this particular case, is that this hybrid product allows us to put these types of hard ceramics, and I call them ceramics because they're meant to replace stones and tiles that you see traditionally being used in everyday use in our homes and buildings. So imagine if you could, create those products, through local manufacturers, but using waste glass and waste textiles and coffee cups and all kinds of other exciting things that we currently just see them as throwaway items. So that's another technology that we've developed, and indeed, our journey for commercializing that technology is happening right now. We've been funded to set up that line commercially this year. So that physical sciences funding that we received through the New South Wales Office of the Chief Scientist is an example where it's about really taking a lot of that science, but showing a pathway to commercialization. And so we're really excited that it is very much about being able to show how we can create impact with these technologies for the benefit of everyone. So the fact that we're working with end users and indeed operators, people who want to operate these microfactories, is a classic example of, at the grassroots level, whether you're somebody who works in the building sector or you're actually someone who is a manufacturer or indeed someone who might have a pile of waste textiles, in that ecosystem, we're all connected. And I think this is the point of having that collaborative, approach towards addressing some of these challenges. And a lot of people across the world don't know what to do with some of these products. We know, for example, with waste textiles, there's huge stockpiles of such waste resources. So the fact that you can see this as potentially an Australian technology that could then, enable others in the world to also solve similar problems is an exciting journey for us.
Can Australia perform all parts of the process, recycle, transform and manufacture?
Oh, absolutely. If we decide that there are certain, I'm not saying we have to do it for each and every type of product. Yes, it's a business decision as to how we choose to invest in some technologies, as you would make any other decisions to invest in any venture. But I think, to me, once we decide that, yes, we want to be able to, do our recycling onshore in Australia, and we want to be able to create value-added products for our economy, then absolutely we can do the lot. Because let's face it, we've got, feedstocks of waste glass and electronics and tires, and the fact that we can then put it into our supply chains and create valuable materials, and indeed produce, products. Again, how far you want to go in terms of that whole sort of value add. You don't always have to make the finished product. You could be collaborating with the manufacturer somewhere else, where you might create a highly valuable material or a metal, or indeed, like we were talking about the plastic filaments earlier, but then have that as an export, material that actually can earn revenue, because that is a value-added material if you've converted it into value. So again, with manufacturing, it's about creating something where you can really compete in a way that you can show you've got something unique and special to offer. And I think that's really the key element in this conversation. It's manufacturing something, which is value added, and that's part of a global supply chain that you could feed into, and show that what we're producing are sustainable materials, so that your end users who are after, procurement of materials made sustainably, you can actually kind of show that that's what we're doing.
Tell us about micro factories. They're not little tiny little factories in the toy shop. They're actually a factory.
They are. Indeed.
So how many do we have in Australia at the moment?
Yeah, so we've launched 2 microfactories at UNSW in the last couple of years. And one of the first ones we did a couple of years ago was on electronic waste. So the e-waste microfactory is something that we've been doing and inspiring, others to take those opportunities on. So we're working with an e-waste company to look at how we might be able to use our technology to produce some of these value-added products. So that's one example. And another one that we launched where we've got partnership with a business where we're looking at production of these glass and textile tiles. And that's with a regional business operator. So the fact that we've got an opportunity to work and prove that it can be done, whether you're in Sydney or in a regional area, shows that it can be done. And that's really the whole benefit of microfactories, that yes, we might be able to show that we can operate 2 of these at UNSW, but the whole purpose has been very much about, working with businesses to really show that this can really create value for their business and really help solve problems for our society. So whether we're talking about e-waste or glass or textile waste, it's about how these business partners can actually then use it in their business, use that technology to create value-added products for which they know that there is a market. So I think, to me, again, that all-important question, it's not recycling and reforming for the sake of doing it, but it's also, being part of a supply chain where you can right from the beginning see what the market opportunities are. And for us, that's the exciting bit that when we work to really scale up these technologies with our industry partners, the opportunity for them to run it on a scale that makes sense for them is important. And that's the big difference with microfactories. They are very flexible and agile in the way we operate because they are modular units. So for us, the modularity gives any operator the opportunity to start with limited number of modules, get that experience, and as business grows, to really add more modules or see how they can, in fact, use the revenue that they might be earning from the initial setup to really grow their businesses. So I think it's very much about being flexible, but also being responsive to the needs of the market. So the idea that you might have a few different modules producing different types of products in our economy means you could have these two operators that I'm talking about. They're not competing with each other. They are actually producing different types of products. And that's the beauty of microfactories, that you can actually choose the kinds of modules you want, and you can actually work with the materials that you believe are in the best interest of your business. So if I'm an e-waste recycler and I want to be able to take plastics, specifically those that are coming from my particular business, then I'll set up modules to do things with that plastic. And that's really where it gives enormous flexibility for businesses to really go, right, this is my business today, but if I want to grow and add more satellites and really look at where the future is headed, I can actually add some of these modules of a microfactory as I go, so I can actually start to make that investment decision bit by bit. And I think, to me, the modularity allows operators to do exactly that. And this is why we're so excited, because that just means that you can be a big or a small business, an SME in a regional town or in a large capital city, and look at how you might be able to adapt the technology of microfactories to add more value to your business operations, so that you don't have to ultimately send any waste away to landfill. So that's really the goal. If we're sending waste away to landfill, compare that to an opportunity to convert that into a value-added product. Anybody would say, why should I not look at a brand new business opportunity, especially if I know it can generate revenues?
My dad always said, I'm just going to just change it a bit, the world is my recycled oyster. Do you like that one?
Yeah.
Look, exciting times, and still on the cutting edge, which is makes it exciting, because you're going into areas that we really hadn't considered properly. Professor Veena Sahajwalla, thank you very much for your time, and we'll do this more often.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Mike, and I look forward to chatting to you next time.
Hi, it's Brendan Nottle from the Salvos. For 140 years, we've stood with Australians in crisis. Today, as we all rise to the challenge of this heartbreaking time, the Salvos are doing all they can to ease the pain and find a way through for the people hardest hit. You can play a powerful role. If you're able, please go to salvationarmy.org.au and give to the Red Shield Appeal now. Together, we can do this.
You're listening to the Coast Business Radio podcast.
Professor Raina MacIntyre is one of the world's leading emerging infectious disease experts. Professor Raina MacIntyre is NHMRC Principal Research Fellow and Professor of Global Biosecurity. She heads the Biosecurity Program at the Kirby Institute at the University of New South Wales Medicine. First of all, Professor, welcome.
Good day to you.
In 2018 and 2019, you held a pandemic simulation in Australia, Bangladesh and the US. This simulation dealt with all the issues seen during COVID-19, surveillance and case detection, mass quarantine, travel bans, stranded cruise ships. How well did the simulation predict what actually happened?
It was uncanny, actually. Many of the things that we exercised in Pacific Eclipse, which was the name of the exercise, did occur during the COVID pandemic. So we looked at an unknown epidemic that starts on a small scale in the Pacific, in Fiji in this case, And then it gradually gets bigger, it gets identified, and then it becomes a pandemic. And so we looked at public health response, societal response, critical infrastructure, cascading failures that can occur. So some of the things we looked at included stranded cruise ships that weren't allowed to dock anywhere because they had infected people on board, international trade and travel, what happens there, as well as rioting. In our scenario, we had rioting and looting as part of it, linked to shortages of supplies and demand for vaccines and medical equipment, etc. And we also looked at different first responders, whether they be healthcare workers, police, military, emergency services, and other first responders. So it was, and some of the basic public health lessons are things that people seem to have been quite confused by during COVID-19. And I think partly that's because we've enjoyed the success of vaccines for over a century. And so I think there's been a sort of corporate loss of memory of what you need to do on a mass scale to control a pandemic, which is why we've seen a lot of, struggle in terms of trying to control the disease.
What lessons then were successfully adopted in 2020 from the simulations you conducted?
Well, I can't. There were a lot of different participants from different jurisdictions. Different, it was held in the US, and there were people from different state health departments and state agencies, as well as from the CDC and from other countries as well. So individually, I don't know how it's played out in each of their jurisdictions, but I have heard back from several of them that it was very useful to think about how to pull together the response.
Do you think Australia was better prepared than other jurisdictions, other countries?
Well, I think Australia's response was really excellent. The proof is in the pudding. We've got very low case numbers. I think the biggest success there was the border control. It was done early. It was done decisively, and that really has led to a major reduction in the cases, and the rest of the response, the scaling up of testing and so on, has also been really exemplary.
In the beginning, it was hard to understand then why resources weren't directed to those most vulnerable, that testing was unavailable to determine where the sick were, but that lockdown applied to the whole population. Was this expected?
So when you don't have a vaccine or a drug, that may be one of the few things available to you. Really, you've only got a few things to try and control the pandemic. One is finding every single case and isolating them. And to do that, you have to test. And if you don't have tests, you can't find the cases, and the epidemic just gets bigger and bigger. And that's what happened in the US. The second is you have to trace all the contacts of every case and identify where they are, and then quarantine them for the incubation period so that they don't pass on infection to anyone else if they get infected. Then you need the social distancing, and that includes at the most extreme end of the scale, the lockdown. But at the other end of the scale is spatial distancing of 1.5 metres, which has been shown to be highly effective. The lockdowns, I think, have been effective everywhere where they've been used. Everywhere where they've been used, it's led to a substantial decline in cases. And the other thing, of course, is the travel bans. And face masks as well probably have some role.
We've had a lot of comment about where this could have originated. Was it from a market? Was it from a lab? Have you pondered this over a good glass of red to determine where this may have come from? Because we still don't know really, but a lot of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, we don't know, and I think anyone who trumpets any theory with great certainty is just lying, because we don't know enough about this virus. We're learning new things every day, just how the virus behaves, the different kind of complications and so on. So nobody should be, carrying on with great certainty that it's this or it's that. But I think everyone should keep an open mind, as to what the origin is. We don't know yet. And yes, it has had a lot of us thinking about what the origin could be.
You've done a lot of work on biosecurity risks. What do you think is the most likely threat in the near future? Is it smallpox or maybe a synthetic agent? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think in the near future it's COVID-19. Until we've got this controlled, it's going to be, plaguing our lives in one form or another. If it's not controlled in other parts of the world, it's going to continue to be a problem for us even after we have a vaccine. So really, until, the majority of the world's population can be vaccinated with an effective vaccine, this is going to be what's plaguing us. Of course, on top of that, there could be other infectious disease epidemics. But I think the other thing that we've seen in recent weeks is that this issue of cascading societal failures. When you look at how one catastrophic event like the pandemic can intensify other types of failures. So we've got the riots that are going on in the US at the moment that are directly, acting in the opposite direction of what you want public health control, in the sense that lots of people are congregating together. Use of tear gas and so on is making people cough and, expel aerosols. So you're having a situation where, in your normal pandemic plan, that's not there, right? There's nothing in there about how do we deal with the rioting that's going to happen. Pandemic planning is very health-centric and very narrow. It really doesn't fail. It fails to consider the broader societal impacts. And I was talking to a colleague in the US, and they said, we've got our hurricane season and our wildfire season starting soon. So they're going to have, in the US, for example, they're going to have to be coping with COVID, race riots, wildfires and hurricanes all simultaneously. So I think we need to have better ways of dealing with problems across disciplines and areas, and not treat them as silos.
Just I was just thinking over the weekend, because we're talking about riots in the US, and a lot of them aren't wearing masks, and the police aren't wearing masks and stuff like that. We got protests throughout Australia over this weekend, 31,000 or more just in Melbourne alone. Do you think the government should say, sorry guys, we understand you want to protest about something, but now is not the time?
Look, I'm not sure what the legal framework is and whether the government can say that or not. I don't know. I think I have heard the debate going on in the US with public health people weighing in, and some of them are saying, well, this Black Lives Matter is a public health issue. But from a disease control point of view, it's a concern, I mean, I would be expecting, not so, in Australia we may be okay because there's not a lot of disease around, but in somewhere like the US, there's a hell of a lot of disease around. They haven't got on top of it, nowhere near on top of it. So there's a lot of disease there, and all these people congregating in close quarters, being tear gassed and coughing, it's a recipe for disaster. I would expect that there may be, a surge in cases in a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks in the US.
There's been a lot of criticism of the federal government and in the UK and even the US until this thing escalated. And a lot of commentators and people were saying, well, look at Sweden. They're doing this sort of herd immunity mentality. It really hasn't worked out that well for Sweden. They're just skyrocketing in numbers.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's a lot of, half-baked theories floating around, and people who don't have the expertise to really understand what they're talking about, including people who are in some form of health experts of some kind, but don't have that kind of expertise, are going around banding these theories about, let's stop contact tracing, let's do herd immunity, without actually understanding what it means, where it came from, and that's the problem. There's kind of a kind of chaos in terms of the chaos and I have to say, a lack of leadership in a lot of, I'm not talking about any country in particular, but just seeing how things have panned out, where's all the expertise gone? Why are there people without the right, where are the people with the right kind of expertise to kind of knock these theories on the head and get people going in the right direction? We've had, a whole lot of strange theories being propagated, for which there are, over a century of knowledge from the past. But, it's quite disturbing.
Well, my dad always says a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. Perhaps that's the case.
It certainly is.
But also here's the quandary. You mentioned that the medical experts, each state has their own chief medical officer, basically, and we got this national cabinet, and they all get together and they say, okay, we're going to do this, and they go out and do their own thing. We've got, some states, the borders are not there, and other states, the borders are there, and different sorts of measures to control this. You're a scientist. Tell me, why can't they, if they agree in that national cabinet, why can't they agree out of it?
Well, because I guess there's different voices, different expertise in the mix in jurisdictions versus Commonwealth, and I actually think it's not a bad thing. It's federation in a way gives us some checks and balances, and I think it's not always a bad thing.
How well do you think, say, countries like Australia are placed to handle, after we get past COVID-19, we can always look forward to another pandemic. Do we have the ability now to approach these issues, whether they're natural or man-made viruses?
I don't know. Mike, I'm not that optimistic, to be honest. We've known enough for a long time. We went through the 2009 influenza pandemic, and the same sort of, I don't know. We'll have to see.
Today I was thinking how things are just sort of dying down because you get that attitude, you become a bit blasé, until I looked at one of the maps around the world, and not too sure whether that was just hysteria from the media, but it's not getting any better. It's still just ramping up, isn't it?
Yeah, no, when you look at the WHO situation report, it's on the way up.
Absolutely scary. But what isn't scary, I've got to mention this, I'm just reading about your home-cooked Sri Lankan chicken with coconut milk rice. It looks delightful.
It is good.
And just send me the invitation when you're ready. Raina, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
Coronavirus is most likely to spread from person to person when we come into close contact with one another. We can all help stop the spread by keeping our distance. This means do not shake hands or exchange physical greetings, and wherever possible, stay at least 1.5 metres away from others. It's also really important to practice good hygiene, especially after being in public places. Together, we can help stop the spread and stay healthy. Visit health.gov.au to learn more. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
This is the Coast Business Radio podcast.
The Australia-China Relations Institute is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese studies centres exist in other Australian universities. However, the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship to these countries. Professor James Laurenceson is the director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. Professor Laurenceson is an expert on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China relationship. His opinion pieces have appeared in the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, South China Morning Post, and numerous others, I would imagine. Is that right, Professor?
Just a couple others, Mike.
But too many to mention. Now, is Chinese influence in Australian academic institutions and politics a real, or is it just an imagined problem?
Mike, I would say it's both. So it is absolutely real. For example, there are plenty of instances of Chinese students telling their Australian lecturers that they're worried about speaking openly in class, critical of the Chinese Communist Party, because they're worried that their comments might somehow make it back to the Chinese embassy in Canberra, or their parents back home in Beijing or Shanghai might face a visit from the police. So that's absolutely real. On the other hand, some of the allegations that are made are imaginary. So one common one I've heard, for example, is that Australian academics have been forced to apologise to Chinese students for saying things that are critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, I've done a bit of digging on that and some research, and it turns out in not a single case has an Australian academic been forced to apologise for doing something like that. So this is what makes studying the Australia-China relationship complicated, because there's a lot of real stuff happening that is of genuine concern, and there's a bit of an imaginary stuff as well.
Fake news, it lives everywhere, to quote Donald Trump. It's just everywhere. But it also sells newspapers, or clickbait too, isn't it?
That's true. That makes things very complicated. And of course, it's even better if that clickbait can be black and white and expressed in very simple sound bites. And if there's one thing I've learned about studying China and the Australia-China relationship is that it is nearly always complicated. So it doesn't lend itself to a single sound bite.
How do you see this relationship between the two countries changing then over the next 10 years?
I think it is almost certain to get more complicated for a very simple reason in this case. I think over the last few years you've seen China's assessments of its interests and Australia's assessments of its interests diverge. And that just means there's fewer areas where we can work together on. For example, you'd be familiar with China's assertive activities in the South China Sea, building artificial islands, disregarding international law in the process. Well, it's in Australia's interest that international law is abided by. So, of course, the Australian government speaks out. The Chinese government doesn't like that. And so we have this tit for tat. But you can't get away from that. So it is going to be more complicated. Just one final quick point there, though. For all the complication, all the benefits are real as well. So two-way trade between Australia and China right now is currently at record highs. And that means hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs. So it's a very complicated space.
And again, the media, I mean, truly, I don't think they're terribly bright these days. Anyway, now, one of the Institute's recent papers noted that there are some misconceptions that both hold about each other. What are those misconceptions, and can they be resolved?
There's a few, but look, let me just give you one from each side to give you a flavour. So one of the main Chinese government talking points I hear these days is that Australia is simply an American lapdog. We do anything the Americans want us to do. Well, look, of course, we're an American security ally, so we take that bilateral relationship seriously. But in fact, there's plenty of examples, including just very recently, where we haven't done what the Americans wanted us to do. For example, Scott Morrison hasn't called COVID-19 the Chinese virus. Our Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, hasn't started spreading COVID-19's conspiracy theories like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has. On the other side, I think there's a tendency in Australia to imagine that China is a big monolith with all the strings pulled from the top, with Xi Jinping, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, sitting in Beijing. In fact, China's one of the world's largest land masses, 31 provinces, 1.4 billion people. A lot of the stuff in China happens from the bottom up, not from the top down.
I was talking to Nikolai Petrovsky last week about his research into COVID-19, and I came out and said, "Look, China's been a bit of a stumbling block here," and he said, "Well, probably the opposite." China is really Australia's greatest collaborator, as I get my teeth around that one, in research. How did this come about, and will that change? And the myth that China is throwing up these roadblocks, it really isn't doing that. That's what I found out, so I take that back. And again, media hysteria, because that's what you go by.
Yeah, well, so that's where media hysteria really doesn't help, does it? Because, look, there's one thing we can all agree on, is that for all the genuine challenges that China presents to Australia, we want to be responding to those challenges on the basis of facts and evidence. And so if that's not coming through in the media, then it actually makes responding even to the genuine challenges to be harder. China is, it's true, more Australian scientific papers now are written with Chinese collaborators than American ones. This has been a very rapid development, mostly occurred over the last decade. And look, the main driver of it is simply that China itself has emerged as a major creator of new knowledge, a major technological power. Just for example, just one Chinese company, you may have heard of the Chinese tech company Huawei, spends more on research and development each year than all Australian businesses combined. So when you've got that scale and resources at your disposal, it's not surprising that Australian researchers are attracted to partnering with China.
A common charge is that China benefits more than Australia in some areas of this relationship, such as agricultural investment. Now, is this China's fault or is it our fault?
Well, let's make sure we've got the facts right to start with. So Australian farmers are not complaining about China. In fact, they're one of the big groups that are talking up the China relationship because they know they sell a lot of their output to China. You take China away and Australian farmers are a whole lot poorer. It is true that Chinese investors now hold more agricultural land than any other country with the exception of the UK. But even there, you've got to be very careful because, in fact, 85% of the Chinese controlled land in Australia is in fact in the form of the S. Kidman cattle stations, and that's 80% freehold land. So the Chinese investors don't actually own the underlying asset. Moreover, the Chinese investor there is in fact a company that's 2/3 owned by Gina Rinehart, Australia's richest woman. The Chinese investor, in fact, only owns 1/3. So again, this comes back to a complicated story where you really need to focus on the facts.
Interesting that it's going to be harder to invest. And again, today, headlines, China, they may not be very happy with the new rules and regulations brought in.
Look, as long as the rules are applied to all countries, I don't think you're going to get much pushback from China. Where China has objected most in the past is when the Australian government has specifically singled China out as a reason that legislation or new rules were introduced. But in this case, I haven't seen the Australian government do that. So far, so good.
Huawei, you mentioned Huawei before, and China with cyber espionage, hand in hand almost. This untrusting issue between China and Australia when it comes to cyber espionage, can this be resolved?
Well, not unless China stops doing it. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Well, we should be clear. For a start,
all countries do it.
Exactly. That was my point. So every country engages in cyber espionage. If we're talking about espionage, we really can't get too excited about China doing it because we do it as well. And you can bet everything that the Americans are doing it even more than the Chinese are. Where the Australian government, I think, legitimately objects is when the Chinese, or frankly any country, engages in cyber theft of commercial secrets. I mean, that's not okay. We're entitled to push back and attribute those attempts to China when we've got good evidence that they are in fact coming from China. Well, you can't stop it, but you can manage it. And I guess that was part of the thinking behind why the Australian government in 2018 decided to rule out Huawei from participating in Australia's 5G rollout.
Do you think, I'm just looking at, you mentioned that Huawei spends so much money on investment into technology. And to quote from a movie, it's more of a China syndrome that, the Chinese are going to be listening in. Don't buy a toaster from Huawei.
Yeah, look, I'm prepared to give the Australian government the doubt, simply because someone like me, someone like you, most other commentators, we don't have access to all the intelligence information. So I'm just going to have to trust that the Australian government made that call on the basis of some sound evidence. What we do know, of course, is that relatively few other countries have taken the same degree of step that Australia did, and that is to ban Huawei. Many countries are still allowing them to participate in some parts of the network. So then you've got to ask, well, what information do they have that the Australian government apparently doesn't? But it's a little bit out of my knowledge, unfortunately.
Your pay grade.
Well, yeah, my security clearance.
Hey, look, China has this great economic clout around the world, for obvious reasons. But do you think that economic clout is being weaponized by the Chinese leadership?
Yes, it can be and sometimes is, but again, it's more complicated than that. First of all, the Chinese are not the only superpower that weaponize trade. The United States, particularly under the Trump administration, openly and proudly weaponizes trade links. So it's not just a China-specific phenomenon. But look, it's true. I think there's enough historical and international evidence to say that from time to time, China does, when it politically disagrees with another country, it does resort to using economic links such as trade as punishment. But again, there's a tendency in Australia to attribute every trade disruption with China to economic coercion or punishment for political disagreements. We might be seeing one of those cases now in the situation of Australian barley. A couple of weeks ago, it had a 80% tariff slapped on it by the Chinese government. That was quickly seized upon as evidence that China was trying to punish Australia for calling for an independent international inquiry into COVID-19 spread. But it's actually got an 18-month backstory, and it looks to me that what the Chinese are reacting to is, in fact, Australia putting in place tariffs on Chinese imports. So this is, in fact, the first Australian export that the Chinese have put in place anti-dumping tariffs on. We already have 17 Chinese imports that we put in place anti-dumping tariffs on. So I think, if anything, Chinese are probably reacting to that, not trying to punish us for political disagreements.
Again, the media. We don't hear that, do we?
No, we don't, but it probably took me 2 or 3 minutes to give you my last answer, and I think that's the challenge. The facts and evidence are there, but they're not simple. It is complicated, and it does take a bit of time, so it doesn't lend itself to a soundbite.
Now, the other issue that's on the tips of everybody's tongue, the national security law being passed in Hong Kong. First of all, what's your thoughts on that, and will this affect the relationship with Hong Kong?
I think that development is a real tragedy. And I say a tragedy because I can't see how the situation, the tension gets easily resolved. First of all, no one disagrees that Hong Kong is part of Chinese territory, right? That's a fact. We're not arguing about that. But what we do have some legitimate grievances with China over is the application of the one country, two systems agreement that China signed up to and said it would abide by for 50 years after 1997. This new law seems to me to be a step back from that commitment. And look, certainly Hong Kong citizens have made their feelings very clear. They don't want it. So I think it's appropriate, again, given Australia has interests in Hong Kong. Of course, we've got many immigrants from Hong Kong, but we also have business interests there as well. Hong Kong's a major trading partner for us. It hosts many Australian companies' international headquarters. So, look, I think the Australian government's got their messaging on this right. I think they're entitled to speak up. Will that lead to much change? Well, no, I'm probably not so optimistic. And, in the end, I don't think, Hong Kong will still remain a very important international financial centre, in my view, despite these new laws.
With your experience and your knowledge of China, this is, again, left field here, how do you think, first of all, the average Chinese, how would they be feeling, or would they know much about what's happening right now with the world sort of going to China, whoa, stop, otherwise we'll smack your hands? And secondly, the CCP, what would their attitude be? So we've got two sides here from mums and dads and people going about the work every day, and the other side from the ruling party.
Well, I think you've made a very crucial distinction there, and it's an important one, and I wish we talked about it more. So the Chinese Communist Party, the government, the ruling party, one-party state, its attitude towards Australia is not at all positive at the moment. An Australian Prime Minister hasn't been able to secure an invitation to visit China since 2016. So clearly the diplomatic and political side of the bilateral relationship is tense. On the other hand, let's talk about those mums and dads. Well, we know how they feel because two-way trade between China and Australia at the moment is at record highs. And it's not just iron ore. It's across the board. It's dairy, it's wine, it's beef, it's tourism, it's education. Never been higher, apart from these recent COVID-19 restrictions, of course. So there is a very fundamental distinction that we always need to be clear on when we're talking about China. And that is the distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the 1.4 billion Chinese people.
How do you feel, though, with the average Chinese middle class, and they really love the comforts of home? Where do you think this will end? Because there is this great clash right now, and you hear again through the media, but you hear that leadership may not be feeling all that comfortable with their decisions to date.
Well, this is where this is a hard message for many Australians to learn because, of course, the natural Australian instinct towards the Chinese Communist Party is that it is not a positive one. We're rather fond of liberal democracy, and so we should be. But if you ask the average Chinese citizen, what do they think of the Chinese Communist Party? Overall, and I say overall because there's areas where they're not, but overall, they're actually pretty positive towards their government. Moreover, as they look around the world now, they look at America, they look at Brexit in the UK, it doesn't strike the average Chinese on the street in Beijing or Shanghai that the liberal democracies offer a particularly great model for China. Look, the reality is over the last 40 years, for the average Chinese citizen, their living standards have increased immensely, and some of the credit, not all of the credit, but they will give some of the credit for that to the Chinese Communist Party. So, we can't think about the Chinese Communist Party in terms of good and evil, or we can, but that's not how the average Chinese citizen thinks about it. And I think we owe it to them, and we owe them enough respect to take their views into account.
Okay, now this is because we haven't had a whiskey here. We can't look into a crystal ball here and get something really illuminating. But just imagine you've had a great cup of coffee. The blood's pumping through the vein. You've got your crystal ball there. Where do you see this relationship? Not forget Australia with China and the rest of the world in a few years' time.
I remain with a glass half full. Because China, the reality is that China depends on the rest of the world for a lot of its needs. Jeff Raby, the former Australian ambassador to China, he describes China as a constrained superpower because it's utterly dependent on international markets to supply some pretty basic goods. In Australia's case, for example, more than 60% of China's iron ore comes from Australia. So I can't imagine China lashing out and damaging its own interests so severely. And look, similarly from an Australian perspective or even a broader Western perspective, the economic relationship, at least with China, has been a good one. China is not the enemy, Mike. I mean, that's one thing. Sometimes you'll almost get the impression it is. The reality is that Chinese demand, the increase in China's economy and its purchasing power, and the fact that it actually wants Australian goods and services, unlike, frankly, the Americans who aren't particularly interested, that's a good story for Australia's national interest. So put those together, and I think I'm still remaining cautiously optimistic.
We're talking business, nothing but talk.
This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.